He had ordered men killed for less than a whisper out of place. Chen Lee Dong stood in the doorway of his own kitchen at 2 a.m., the city lights of Seoul bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling glass behind him, and stared at the small pair of eyes staring back at him from behind the refrigerator. A child, maybe 6, maybe 7, a half-eaten bowl of cold rice cradled in both hands like something precious, caught. He had not known she existed. He had not known Grace, quiet, efficient, invisible Grace, had a daughter at all. The child must have been sneaking in after her mother finished the night shift, surviving on whatever was left in the kitchen after the household retired. The girl did not run, she did not cry, she just looked at him with enormous, unblinking eyes and, very slowly, offered him the rice. Chen Lee Dong, head of the Dongchun Syndicate, a man who had never once in 40 years been offered something without a price attached to it, sat down on the floor of his own kitchen and accepted. The city never slept when Chen Lee Dong was awake. From the 42nd floor, Seoul spread itself below him like a circuit board, a billion watts of commerce and consequence, none of it touched by silence. His penthouse existed above the noise, but never apart from it. The calls came at all hours, the reports arrived before dawn. Men who controlled entire districts waited, sometimes for days, for 5 minutes of his attention. He gave it when he chose, he withheld it when it served him. This was the nature of power as he understood it, not the noise of it, but the gravity. His name was spoken carefully in certain rooms and not at all in others. The Dongchun Syndicate had operated for decades under figures who confused loudness for authority. Chen had taken what they built and stripped it to its architecture, removed the excess, tightened the margins, replaced sentiment with precision. Within 3 years of his ascension, the organization had tripled its reach and halved its exposure. He had not celebrated. He had gone back to work. The penthouse reflected this. No excess, clean lines, low furniture, one shelf of books he had actually read. The staff moved through it like water around stone, present, efficient, invisible. That was how he preferred them. That was how he preferred most people. There were 12 people on his household payroll. He knew each of their names, their schedules, their particular usefulness. He knew what they were paid, what they owed, what leverage the world held over them. This was not cruelty, it was fluency. In his world, information was the only currency that never devalued. What he did not know, what had not appeared in any report, had not been flagged by any member of his staff, was that one of them had a daughter. He had not thought to ask, it had not seemed relevant. Sometimes, very late, when the calls had ended and the city had dimmed itself to a low hum, he stood at the glass and felt the distance between himself and everything below as something other than advantage. There was a word for it he did not use. He had learned, a long time ago in a cramped apartment in Busan, that naming a thing gave it weight, that a mother singing in a kitchen was a sound you could carry for 30 years without meaning to, that a younger sister's hand, small and warm and trusting, was a thing you could still feel in the dark. He had built all of this so that no one he loved would ever go hungry again. The irony, if he had allowed himself to feel it, was that everyone he had ever loved was already gone. He turned from the window, poured himself 2 fingers of water, never whiskey, not anymore, set the glass down, went to bed. He had not yet found her. Grace had perfected the art of taking up no space. It was not timidity. Anyone who mistook it for that did not last long in her estimation. It was craft, the kind you develop when you understand, early and completely, that a woman who makes herself visible in the wrong room pays a price for it. She had learned which footsteps echoed and which did not. She had learned where to stand so that a person's eye slid past her without catching. She had learned to complete every task before it was requested, so that her presence was never the thing a room remembered, only its effects. She had been doing this for 22 years in 4 countries and 7 households, and she was exceptionally good at it. The penthouse was, by any measure, her most demanding post. Not because of the hours, though the hours were long, and not because of the standards, which were exacting in the way only very wealthy men's standards could be. It was demanding because Chen Lee Dong paid attention. Most employers saw their domestic staff like they saw furniture, necessary, replaceable, beneath real observation. Chen saw everything. She had understood this in her first week when she found a single dish misaligned in the cabinet and corrected it before he ever entered the kitchen. Later, she realized he had placed it that way deliberately to see if she would notice. She had not let herself be tested twice. She needed this job. That was the plain truth of it, and Grace had no patience for dressing plain truths in finer clothes. She needed it the way you need the specific thing that stands between your child and hunger, not abstractly, but with a precision that sharpened every decision she made. Dorcas was 7. School fees were due in March. The roof of the apartment leaked when it rained, which in Seoul was often. So Grace worked, and Grace was careful, and Grace did not ask for anything she had not already earned. What she had not planned for, what no amount of careful had been able to prevent, was Dorcas, not her daughter's existence. That was the greatest thing she had ever done, and she would burn the world before she apologized for it. What she had not planned for was Dorcas's particular personality, her absolute refusal to be afraid of things other people found frightening, her bottomless curiosity, her gift for slipping through spaces adults had declared closed. The arrangement felt manageable at first. Dorcas waited in the staff room during Grace's night shifts. She slept when she was told. She was quiet when it mattered. She was 7 years old, and she was trying so hard. Grace had not known about the kitchen, not for certain. She had suspected, the way a mother suspects everything, cataloging small evidence, a moved stool, a bowl rinsed and replaced at the wrong angle. But she had not let herself confirm it, because confirmation would require action, and action required a choice she was not ready to make. She could not be seen. She could not afford for Dorcas to be seen. What she could not have known, what neither of them could have known, was that it was already too late for invisible. By 6 a.m., Chen had already read the overnight reports, signed off on 2 transfers, and stood at the window long enough to watch the city decide it was day. The world, as far as it was concerned, had not changed. He had a 9 o'clock with the Port Authority liaison. He had a call at 11 with the Incheon operation. He had lunch with no one, the way he preferred, and an afternoon that would disappear into paperwork before he looked up. This was the texture of his days, structured, useful, empty in the specific way that very full lives could be empty. He sat at his desk. He read the first report. He read it again. He had not slept particularly well. The inquiry he placed was a small thing, professionally speaking, a single question routed through his household manager, discreet, unattributed, the kind of administrative note that would not register as significant to anyone paying casual attention. He wanted to know about Grace, not her work record, which he already held, her situation, whether she had family, whether she was managing. The answer came back before noon. Single mother, 1 daughter, 7 years old, no extended family in Seoul. The address apartment was in a district he knew well, practical and unadorned, the kind of place people lived when they were doing everything right and it still wasn't quite enough. He read the note twice. Then he set it in the drawer where he kept things he was not ready to file and not willing to discard. He said nothing to Grace. He had no idea what he would have said, and he had not survived 40 years in his world by opening his mouth before he understood the shape of what he was trying to say. So he said nothing. What he did instead was mention to his kitchen manager in passing that the household provisions felt thin, that leftovers should not be an afterthought, that the pantry ought to be kept better stocked, fruit especially, mango if they could get it, the good kind. He did not explain why. He was not asked. Grace found the fruit on a Tuesday, a whole bowl of it on the kitchen counter, mango, perfectly ripe, the variety Dorcas would eat until her fingers were sticky and her chin was stained gold. Dorcas's favorite. Grace had never mentioned it to anyone in this household. She was certain of that, the way she was certain of very few things. She stood very still for a long moment, her hand resting on the counter's edge. There was no note, there was no explanation, there was only the fruit, sitting in its bowl in the middle of the kitchen as though it had always been there. Grace had spent 22 years learning to read the rooms she worked in. She could interpret a misaligned dish. She could understand a rearranged schedule. She had always known when something was a test and when something was a message. She picked up the mango, set it back down, and began to, very carefully, be afraid. She found him on a Thursday afternoon, which was as far as Dorcas was concerned as good a day as any. Chen was in his study. The door had been opened by perhaps 4 inches. Not an invitation, merely an oversight, the kind that happened when a man had lived alone long enough to forget that open doors were a language. Dorcas understood doors. She understood that 4 inches was not closed, and not closed was close enough. She knocked on the frame, once with one knuckle, the way her mother had taught her. Then she pushed it open the rest of the way and walked in. Chen looked up from his desk. His face did the thing he always did when presented with an unexpected variable. It went very still while the rest of him calculated. He had a response prepared for almost any kind of intrusion: lieutenants who overstepped, associates who tested boundaries, men who arrived without appointments to find out. She found out on a Friday evening from Dorcas herself, who mentioned it the way children mention things they do not yet understand are significant. "I gave him my drawing," Dorcas said, eating her rice, feet swinging under the staff room chair. "The nice man. He kept it." Grace set down her fork. She asked, very evenly, which drawing. Dorcas described it. She asked, still evenly, where this had taken place. Dorcas said the study. Grace asked whether anyone had told her to go to the study. Dorcas considered this question with the gravity it deserved and said no, but the door had been open. Grace did not raise her voice. She finished the meal, washed the dishes, settled Dorcas onto the cot in the corner with a book, and then sat very still for 11 minutes, while the specific quality of her fear transformed itself into something harder and more useful. Then she went to find him. Chen was still in his study. She knocked once and did not wait to be invited. He looked up. Something in his expression registered that this was not a standard interruption, and to his credit, she would note this later, quietly, to herself, he did not perform impatience. He simply waited. She told him, standing in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and her voice completely level, that her daughter was not a project, not a curiosity, not something to be observed or collected or filed away in whatever system he used to manage the people around him. She told him that Dorcas was 7 years old and had no frame of reference for the kind of world he inhabited, and that it was not her daughter's responsibility to acquire one. She told him plainly, whatever this was, it needed to stop. She had prepared for several responses: dismissal, cold anger, the particular silence that precedes termination. She had her next month calculated, what she could sell, how far the savings would stretch, which agency she could call on Monday. Chen said, "You're right." That was all. 2 words, spoken without hesitation, without performance, without the slight upward inflection men sometimes use to make capitulation sound like generosity. Just the plain acknowledgement, offered and left to stand. Grace had been preparing for a fight for 11 minutes. She had not prepared for this. She looked at him, really looked, the way she rarely let herself look at employers, and saw something she had not expected to find. Not guilt, not calculation, something quieter than either. A man who had just been told a true thing and recognized it as true, and was not ashamed of that. She nodded once, turned to leave. "Grace." She stopped. He said, "She is not in any danger here." It was not a defense. It was not a reassurance. It was simply another true thing, placed beside the first one. Grace walked back to the staff room. She did not feel less afraid, but the fear had changed shape, and she was honest enough with herself to know that was not nothing. His name was Kang Jae-won, and he had been watching for 3 weeks. He was Chen's second, not by accident and not by loyalty in any sense that the word usually implied. He held the position because he was precise, because he was patient, and because he understood, better than most, that power was not a thing you seized, it was a thing you waited for. You studied the person who held it, you noted where they were soft, and then you waited some more. He had been waiting a long time for Chen to be soft about something. The first move was a reassignment. Grace's night schedule was quietly restructured, a memo from the household manager, entirely routine in tone, citing a rebalancing of shift coverage. She was moved to daytime hours only. The penthouse's upper floors, where Chen spent his evenings, were placed outside of the scope of her duties. It was the kind of change that, on paper, was not a change at all. Grace noticed immediately. She said nothing, which Kong had anticipated. People in her position rarely said anything. That was what made them useful as instruments. The second move was a conversation. Kong found her in the service corridor on a Wednesday morning, between the linen room and the back stairwell, and spoke to her the way men in his position speak when they want to be understood without being quotable. He said he hoped she was settling into her new hours. He said the household valued consistency. He said with a particular evenness that disruptions, of any kind, had a way of affecting everyone, not just the people at the center of them. He looked at her for a moment after he said it, just long enough. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that has no warmth anywhere inside it, and walked away. Grace stood in the corridor for a long time after he left. She understood the message. She had been in enough rooms, in enough countries, to know a boundary marker when one was placed at her feet. This was not a warning about her work. This was a warning about Chen, about what it meant that Chen had noticed her, and about the cost to her and Dorcas if that noticing continued. Chen was aware of it on a Thursday, not through any report. Kong was too careful for that, but through the specific silence of a household that had shifted without being told to. Grace was absent in the rooms he moved through in the evenings. Her schedule, when he checked it, had been altered without his instruction. He sat with this for a while. He recognized the architecture of it immediately. He had designed this kind of move himself, years ago, for different purposes. The message was not meant for Grace. It was meant for him. You have something you are not willing to lose. We have found it. Govern yourself accordingly. Chen closed the schedule report. He did not call Kong. He did not reverse the reassignment. He did nothing, which was itself a kind of answer, the kind that bought time while the rest of him decided what came next. But something had shifted in him the way the air shifts before weather. Quiet, certain, not yet visible. He asked her to stay after the evening shift. Not an order, a request, which was its own kind of signal in a household that ran on instruction. Grace came to the kitchen at 9. Chen was already there, standing at the counter with a cup of tea that he had made, himself, which she had never seen him do. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then seemed to decide something, and sat too. Neither of them spoke immediately. This did not feel to them like the seances they were accustomed to, the managed kind, the kind with power running underneath it. This one was different, uncertain and oddly level, the way ground feels after rain. He said, "I am aware of what Kong did." Grace said nothing. He continued, "It will not happen again. You have my word on that." Grace looked at him. She had learned in 5 months in this household to measure the distance between what men in his position said and what they meant. She measured it now. She found, to her careful surprise, no gap. She said, "Why does it matter to you, Dorcas?" Not accusatory, a plain question, asked plainly, because she had decided in the corridor 3 days ago that she was done navigating around the shape of things. Chen set down his cup. He looked at it for a long moment, in the way people look at objects when they are deciding how much of themselves to spend on an answer. He said, "I had a sister." He said it the way you say something you have not said aloud in a long time, not with difficulty, but with the particular care of a word that has been kept in one place for years and is being moved for the first time. He said, She was younger than me, in Busan. He stopped. He did not continue, because there was nothing more he was prepared to say, and because he did not need to. The shape of it was already in the room. Grace looked at him for a long time. She thought of Dorcas sleeping in the staff room, her daughter's particular way of existing in the world, unguarded, certain, entirely herself. She thought of the mango, perfectly ripe, sitting in its bowl without a note. She thought of a drawing taped inside a drawer where no one would see it. She understood. Not everything, but enough. She said, quietly, what was her name? Chen looked up. Something in his face opened and then steadied, the way a door moves in wind. He said, Su-yan. The name sat between them, small and real. Grace did not feel afraid anymore. Chen did not feel ashamed. These were not small things. They sat together in the kitchen a little longer, the tea cooling between them, and outside the city held its breath, the way it sometimes did, without reason, in the deep hours of the night. Kang made his move on a Monday, which was deliberate. Mondays were when Chen took his operational calls from the Incheon office, 3 hours of his attention spoken for, the household at its most unguarded. He sent the termination notice through the household manager at 9:30. Standard language, clean paperwork, 1 month's severance. Generous enough to look reasonable, swift enough to make the point. Grace was to collect her things and be gone before noon. Grace read the notice at the kitchen table. She read it twice, the way she read everything important. Then she folded it along its original crease and sat very still, her hands flat on the surface in front of her, doing the arithmetic of the next 4 weeks. She did not hear Dorcas come in. Her daughter had been in the staff room, and now she was not, because Dorcas treated closed doors the way she treated all closed things, as suggestions. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school shoes, already dressed, and looked at her mother's face. "What's wrong?" she asked, directly, without preamble, the way she asked everything. Grace said, "Nothing. Go and get your bag." Dorcas looked at her for a moment with those unblinking eyes. Then she looked past her, into the kitchen, and Chen was there. He had ended the Incheon call 40 minutes ahead of schedule. He did not explain this to anyone. He had simply set the phone down and walked through his own household until he found them. He stood in the doorway. He looked at Grace, then at the folded notice on the table, then at Dorcas, who looked back at him with an expression entirely unclouded by the room's tension, because she did not yet know what the tension meant. She raised one hand in greeting. He looked at her hand for a moment. Something left his face then, the last of it. The final, careful arrangement he had maintained for so long, it had begun to feel like skin. He said nothing to Grace. He picked up the notice from the table, looked at it once, and tore it in half along the crease she had made. He set both pieces down. Then he took out his phone and called Kang directly. When Kang answered, Chen spoke for 90 seconds. His voice did not rise. It did not sharpen. It carried the specific level quality of a man who has already decided every word before he opens his mouth and has no interest in the response. He said that Grace's position was permanent. He said the terms of her employment fell under his authority alone. He said, and this was the part that would be repeated later in careful whispers through every level of the Dongchen Syndicate, that Kang would resign his post by the end of the week, voluntarily. He ended the call, set the phone on the table beside the torn notice. Dorcas, who had watched all of this with the focused attention she gave to things she found interesting, said, "Are we staying?" Chen looked at her. He said, "Yes." And in every room in that building where someone was paid to listen, they heard it and understood that the man they worked for had changed the terms, and that the terms were not open for discussion. The weeks that followed were not uncomplicated. Kang resigned on a Friday as instructed. 2 of his allies within the organization quietly requested reassignments. The Incheon operation required Chen's attention for the better part of a fortnight, and there were 3 meetings in rooms with no windows where the air tasted like old decisions and everything was decided through implication. None of this was simple. None of it was finished. The world Chen inhabited did not become less dangerous because he had chosen once to act like someone with something worth protecting. But it settled, the way things settle after a line has been drawn in the right place. Not with peace exactly, but with a new understanding of where the edges were. Grace stayed. She had made the decision the way she made most decisions, carefully, with full awareness of the cost, and without illusion about what she was walking further into. She was not naive about the household she worked in. She was not naive about the man at its center. But she had watched him tear a notice along her crease, and she had heard him say a name he had kept for 30 years, and she was, in the end, a woman who believed that people revealed themselves most clearly, not in their best moments, but in the ones they had not prepared for. Dorcas, for her part, noticed none of the tension and all of the important things. She noticed that there was always mango. She noticed that the study door was sometimes left open in the afternoons. She noticed that the nice man looked less like he was waiting for something bad to happen. On a Tuesday in early spring, Chen came down to the kitchen at 7 in the morning. This was not his usual hour. His usual hour was later, after the calls, after the reports had been read, and the day had been arranged around him. But he had woken early and found for perhaps the first time he could remember that he had no inclination to fill the time with work. Grace was at the stove, Dorcas was at the table with a bowl of rice porridge and a running commentary on a dream she had apparently found very significant, involving a tiger, a school bus, and a disagreement about mathematics. She did not pause this commentary when Chen entered. She pulled out the chair beside her with one foot, the way you do for someone whose arrival you have already accounted for. Chen sat. Grace set a cup of tea in front of him without being asked. She did not make an occasion of it. She turned back to the stove. He picked up the cup and held it with both hands, the warmth moving into his palms, and Dorcas said something about the tiger that made no logical sense whatsoever. And outside, Seoul was beginning its day, indifferent and immense, and entirely unaware that something small and irreversible had taken root in a kitchen on the 42nd floor. Chen Lee Dong, head of the Dongchen Syndicate, held his tea and listened. For the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, he looked like a man who was not alone.